Hey everyone, welcome to this discussion on gray is the new green, in which we'll talk about plastics and sustainability and how that relates to packaging in the fashion industry, and just ask and answer all the questions that we're wondering about in terms of the realities and some of the myths of plastics. So I'm joined by Conor Carlin, an old friend of mine who's an expert on the topic. Conor, I'll ask you to do just a quick introduction, and then we can dive into the prepared remarks you have.
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Aishin. My name is Conor Carlin. I'm originally from Ireland and living in Massachusetts, which is not a huge surprise, but it just by way of explaining the accent that may or may not be clear at all times. So Aishin and I went to Babson very closely in time for the master's program, and we're very heavily involved in the clean tech and sustainability programs. I came at it from the plastics industry. I started my career for a machinery firm and went all around the world, Europe and Asia, and learned quite a bit about plastics packaging over that time. At the same time, I joined our industry group. It's not a trade association, so there's no lobbying involved, but the Society of Plastics Engineers, sort of an old-fashioned group of just like-minded people, individual memberships who've joined over many, many years. And so it's a great group where I've learned quite a bit about probably more than I would like to know. And I can't claim to be a scientist or even a chemical engineer like Aishin, but I do play one occasionally in writing and in print. So what we're talking about today then is just sort of my approach to try and synthesize a lot of this information and make it applicable and digestible for people in different industries, so they have a little bit of a deeper dive and be aware of some of the complexities of plastics and packaging that may not be so familiar to people who work in different industries and maybe don't go as deep as we do in ours. Is that okay for the introduction?
That's great, Conor. Thank you.
All right.
Let's dive in.
Okay. So I'll share my screen. We'll go through some slides, guys. I mean, feel free to stop or jump in with questions as we go through it. I'll try to move quickly through so there is time for Q&A at the end. So want to balance between jamming too much information into each particular slide versus giving you guys a chance to pause and ask questions. So, but let's make this a little bit of a back and forth. You can even throw notes in the Q&A too if you want, if it's easier to do it that way. One thing I'd like to do at the outset is just maybe think of what your initial perception is of plastics, given some of the media coverage that we have today. So just as I pull this up, if anybody just wants to throw out a word or two on what comes to mind, that could be helpful as we maybe ground this.
Plastics are forever.
Okay.
Think of using virgin petroleum. The emissions associated with that.
Okay.
Polyester is one of the most used product in fashion, made from plastics.
Okay, great. Yeah, we will touch on each of those, maybe not in fashion specifically in the slides, but we certainly want to talk about that afterwards. So, so the title is just the plastics paradox, right? And we will have some parallels to maybe some other industries, energy in particular, where we see, the usage of plastics and the efficiency associated with it seem to work in tandem in a way that we don't always appreciate. Move forward here. Okay. So basic introduction, just to sort of really splash right into it. Plastics are front and center, and as someone who has been in this industry for a long time, it has most certainly changed in the last 2 years, even maybe going back, 5 years. What I like to say is working at the nexus of plastics and sustainability. It has sort of allowed me to come at it from two different directions. Over 10 years ago, when Aishin and I were working on some of the curriculum development for sustainability at Babson, plastics certainly weren't being talked about the way they are at the moment, even though we were very concerned about waste and recycling. So the issues that come up here, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which people might be aware of, and the National Geographic cover and series certainly brought this into stark relief. but it's maybe not as clear as it's made out to be. And, you know, there's a difference between fact and narrative in terms of human behavior, just even how we think about things, how we digest information, and then how we repeat it, maybe without being so critical. And that's to be expected, because not everybody is going to be an expert in every single industry or market sector or level of specialization. So, but these two things here are quite iconic. The Ellen MacArthur in particular report said that the ratio of plastics to fish in the ocean by weight would be, there'd be more plastics by 2050. Now, this is a meme that has absolutely stuck around, but it has been debunked. It's been debunked by some of the same scientists that were involved in the initial numbers, because if anybody's been involved in any type of forecasting, I mean, we can't even get next year right, never mind 30 years out in the future in 2050. So I say this as a means not necessarily to defend anybody's position, but just to sort of bring to your attention some of the controversies and maybe some of the nuances and complexities, you know, that need to be talked about in detail before people can make, you know, real policy decisions, but also material selection decisions for things like packaging. Another big one that was talked about and has led to, you know, bans of plastic straws. The number that was used for the basis of a lot of these decisions was given by a 9-year-old in his class. You know, the kid was trying to develop some figures as part of a science report or something like that, and it ended up being picked up by all sorts of media outlets until it was finally examined and debunked, you know, back in 2018. So it was something like, you know, the US uses 500 million straws per day, which was nowhere near the level of truth, and when it was debunked, you know, it was much less than half that. And now, of course, you know, you've got people on both sides saying, you know, straws are getting stuck in turtles' noses, but at the same time, paper straws are terrible. They fall apart. They're changing over to polypropylene lids with sip spouts instead of straws, which doesn't really do anything to change the use of plastic. It just sort of makes people feel a little bit better that maybe, you know, they're not using a plastic straw. And then when it comes to the overall, the focus on plastics seems to be a little misguided when you look at the overall use of stuff in general. You know, the facts here on the right, I mean, the global consumption of materials, all materials, you know, is massive, 90 billion metric tons a year, and hardly any of it is being recycled. But when you look at plastics consumption as a subset of that, you see, I mean, it's just, you know, it's like 1%. So it's a lot of material for sure, but the thing is, plastics are so efficient that you can make a lot of them and they have very little impact, both in weight and environmental concerns. And so we'll dig a little bit further into that. So just to give a little bit of context for it, there seems to be a lot of focus on this, and there's nothing wrong with people cleaning up their act. Like any industry that pollutes, you know, they should be held accountable. This is true for chemicals. This is true for gold mining. This is true for you know, palm oil and a lot of these things that we're hearing more often these days. But plastics in particular are in the crosshairs, but it may be a little bit misguided. So anything jump out at anybody there we want to ask at this point, or should we just keep going?
Conor, it's, for me, the slide you had previously is interesting. Even though plastics are, yeah, thank you. Even though plastics are kind of a tiny slice, when I think about ceramics and concrete and metals in particular, those are not, you know, typically in fast moving goods, right? These are in buildings, built environment, and structures that tend to be more permanent. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's such a highlight on polymers and plastics, is that they're much more ephemeral. And so there's a much shorter path from creation to waste. And it's so, I mean, if we looked at, I bet this is a hypothesis, but I bet if we looked at materials entering natural ecosystems, it would be a different pie chart from this. Not saying that plastics would dominate, but I think it would be greater than 1%. So I think that's the, right or wrong, I think it's the visibility of plastics in our everyday lives and how quickly they're going through our linear ecosystem that makes us as circular economy professionals start to think about focusing on plastics rather than a building that's going to be in place for 50 years or so.
That's absolutely true. I mean, they're very careful in in Europe in particular and other places where they're creating regulations to use to identify it as single-use plastic, right? SUP. These are things that are, used once and they're meant to be discarded, right? I mean, 70, 80 years ago, they didn't exist, so people were reusing things just by nature, whether it was glass or ceramics or tin or aluminum or anything else. So you're right. I mean, there's a cheapness associated with plastic. The word itself inspires, a certain connotation of cheapness, which is not totally untrue, but it's a little bit more complex because of what it supplants. But yeah, as we'll see a little bit later when we get to sort of Jevons paradox type approach. I mean, like the linear growth of it is just so far outpacing the ability to deal with it on the back end.
Yeah, thanks. And there's one question in the chat. Does that 1% count for all plastics?
In this case, it does. Yep, in this particular pie chart. Yep. So that would be both thermoplastics, right? Those ones that we typically know from foodstuffs and food packaging. Thermoplastic is just a plastic that can be remelted and made into another one. Thermosets would be the other class. So things like your computer keyboard and a lot of high temperature resistant parts in automotive, in the automotive sector, for example. I mean, they can't be remelted. They can only be, ground down and maybe repurposed, but typically they last a lot longer.
Yeah, another comment from the chat saying this is by weight, which might skew it because, as you said, plastic is pretty efficient. It's pretty light.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, and people. I mean, this was taken from a colleague of sorts in the plastics industry who wrote a book called The Plastics Paradox. I mean, he's a PhD. He's got some sharp elbows and he's sharp-tongued as in his robust defense of the plastics industry as a whole and as a material. So he is, he gets charged of not being neutral, but as a scientist, as a PhD, he uses data for a lot of it, and we'll see that when we talk about life cycle analysis for plastic shopping bags in particular.
You want to see your honey?
Okay. So with people stop and think about plastics or even rethink about it, there's a lot of different levels of information. And there's, from, the meme level, let's say, that's meant to be, quickly and easily digested to, peer-reviewed science in Nature or other journals like that. A lot of the stuff, and this would be true in something like stocks as well. I remember my father once saying to me, who's not an investment banker, a few years ago, maybe 3 weeks before Iceland imploded, he said, "I heard something about investing in Iceland." So by the time certain things make its way down to the layperson, they've gone through a lot of different levels, both integrity of research, but also just public ignorance, and not necessarily in a bad way, just that not everybody can be expected to know everything about every topic all the time. But in numeracy, when looking at data, is a bit of an issue. This is true in finance as well, and certainly true in science, that not everybody understands the statistics, how they're measured. Not everybody knows how to interpret certain types of charts. So that can help explain why you have sayings that lies, damned lies, and statistics is certainly appropriate in some of the stories that you would see about plastics. Confirmation bias, people hear what they want to hear, facts be damned. Again, this is true in politics, this is true in finance, this is true in most of these walks of life. So just another sort of way of looking at it, and especially when it comes to chemistry. And again, I'm not an organic chemist. There's not a huge population of them in the country, let's say. But if you were to look at the ingredients in a cabbage, you would find an awful lot of long, strange, potentially dangerous looking words related to the chemicals, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are inherently bad. So to reference, a 16th century chemist, it's the dose that makes the poison. It's still very true, and it's especially relevant in things like plastics when people talk about toxicity, ecotoxicity, leaching, and things like that. Now, I mean, I think it's fairly easy to say there wouldn't be a whole lot of controversy in saying that there's not a lot of plastics recycled. It's produced at massive scale. It's incredibly efficient. A barrel of oil itself has been, every single last drop of it is used in all the different fuels, as well as, waxes, lubricants, elements of plastics, and so on. But it took us a very, very long time to get to that level of efficiency in that industry. It's certainly not the case that we've reached the same level in plastics recycling, partly because of the amount of time that's gone by, the technology, but also, frankly, the economic incentive is not there, short of mandates and regulations, which we see more often in Europe, for example, and less likely in the States. But when it's not recycled, when it's not managed well, then we do have problems like landfills, incineration, and marine pollution, probably the most visible that we're seeing today. It does typically cost too much to recycle. One of the comments, virgin petroleum and the emissions associated with it. I mean, it's so cheap. It's so cheap to make plastic. We have so much capacity that the amount of steps that are involved in creating recycled plastic essentially wipe out any advantage that it could have in terms of price. All these steps have to be done here unless people are able to try and figure out, some type of mini circular economies in local areas where they can try and cut out some of these steps. Plastics, all the different resin codes that you see on the bottom, they don't commingle, and they can't all be used together without the use of things that they call compatibilizers that will make polyethylene, PE, and polypropylene perhaps live together in any type of mix. So it's not that easy just to put them on a big bucket, heat them, and have them come out even. That's why there's quite a bit of work and science and investment that has to go into recycling them. And collecting and sorting them is the first step, which we just don't do a good job of today. I see some flash up here. Any questions from there, Asheen?
Yeah, Conor, one question that I thought was really apt on the topic of getting some good science and good data from things like straws and the weight of fish, et cetera. Is there a particular organization that works to debunk some of these, memes and myths as they surface that we can look to as kind of a single source of truth on some of these more data-driven topics related to plastics?
It's a single source of truth is you wish it was that easy. I don't know. I don't believe there's a single source. I think you get slightly different interpretations. I think that's part of human nature. The plastics industry associations, like any industry association, there's a high degree of specialization and a lot of good information. So my organization is made up of individual members who work for companies like Dow or Chevron Phillips, or they're retired and they're consultants. We have a lot of papers, that can really get into the development of some of these technologies and the polymers. That's only one part of it. So at least in my perspective, you sort of have to add a few things together. The environmental groups do have some good information as well.
Are there particular environmental groups that you look to that are better equipped to really deal with the science?
I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I have, probably 5,000 PDFs and charts all over the place over the last, a bunch of years for people trying to assess. And so much it's such a fast moving area these days that things are changing all the time. I can put together a short list and share it afterwards. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation has actually done a pretty good job so far in terms of building up and framing the issue backed by statistics. And most people tend to rely on some of the amount of plastics produced, for example, is fairly well known per year. The amount of plastics recycled is fairly well known. You would see the same numbers in a lot of different sources. So I can think about that. I can put together a short list and share it with your group, or share it with you afterwards, Ashina, and then they can see for themselves.
That'd be great. Thanks.
So, and then the recycling business model, at least here in the States, where we tend to be more free market oriented and maybe less inclined to rely on regulations, at the state or federal level, it's a difficult model to make profits in plastics recycling. There are people out there that are obviously doing it, but there's been a lot of new companies that have tried to get into it and end up filing for bankruptcy because the fluctuation in recycled materials in particular are so volatile that it makes it very difficult for them to be able to justify all the capital investments up front, and then make sure that they're getting an ROI. But new opportunities are certainly possible. Like I said, the last 2, 5, 10 years has been a lot of change in this. McKinsey, actually speaking of data sources, as a consultancy with no real axe to grind, I would say, in this world, they certainly have plenty of good information on that. I have 2 of these reports I could share with you guys, both on the chemicals industry as well as some of the plastics side. What we're looking at here is, a potential scenario in the future that would change the makeup of global polymer demand and how it's served, including increased use of mechanically recycled polymers. And then when we'll talk about advanced recycling, it's sometimes called chemical recycling. We can talk a wee bit about that toward the end. But these are pathways to getting more polymers into the market that aren't necessarily coming straight from virgin feedstock. So the future is not condemned to look like the past. It's really the takeaway from here. But it's very complex. It's global. One huge impact, especially for the waste management, not just plastics here in the US, was in 2017 and 2018, and it was broadcast for a very long time. Nobody should have been surprised when China decided that they were going to stop the imports of waste from other countries. They changed the purity level, 0.05% of contamination, which many people feel is just totally impossible to achieve. But it was known, and it led to just a massive buildup and pileup of waste here in the States that wasn't well sorted or washed or cleaned. We essentially have been dumping it in China for many, many years. And that has forced people to take a much more harder look at how we deal with our waste here in this country and other countries, Canada, UK, even the EU. They were still sending plenty of stuff to China. We have to take a much closer look. On the positive side, it is for people to invest and decide to improve our own infrastructure. So there will be some unintended consequences to the upside that come as a result of that. In the top right corner here, something that we probably all see, the changes in the composition of materials, and not just going from glass milk jugs to plastic milk jugs, but you look at so many things are now packaged in flexible materials. If anybody has pets, the pet food, it's almost always in these big bags, and you can't do anything with them. But from an LCA perspective, they're extremely efficient, and they score much better in terms of emissions. So that's a bit of a paradox that everybody has to struggle with. Oil prices obviously have kept things very, very cheap and made it harder for recycled plastics to compete. And then, disposal fees are going up. Even though here in the States, landfill tipping fees are still relatively cheap, it's still the path of least resistance here. In Europe, they have banned landfills in many countries, so they have no other choice except to recycle or incinerate, or the euphemism is to say waste to energy, which isn't untrue because plastics have a lot of embedded energy, and when burned, will be used in a fashion similar to to natural gas or coal or any other fuel source. The pollution and emissions associated with it are a different discussion, but again, there's some economics and some policy decisions that have created a divergence, let's say, between North America and Europe in that particular space. But necessity is a mother of invention, right? Whether it was China's national sword or whether it was people just doing the right thing in the first place, the company here on the right, Preserve, Aishin will know very, very well. These guys were Babson cohorts with us at least just before my time, and they had worked very closely with Stonyfield Yogurt and a company called Berry Plastics to take back all of the number 5, which is propylene, take back those yogurt containers, wash them, grind them, and then repurpose them into things like toothbrushes, cutting boards, cutlery, things that would give a second life. There's no shortage of this happening all over the world, both in the recycling at small scale, but also in terms of bioplastics or bio-based materials, where they're moving away from the fossil-based and trying to get materials made from corn in particular. So PLA is one that people probably know about, and we can talk a bit more about that as well. So, we asked the question, can the entrepreneurs save us? It takes a long time to scale. I think anybody that's in a startup, can certainly attest to that. It doesn't happen overnight, and things that work at lab level don't necessarily work at commercial level. Cellulosic ethanol production, it gives a very sort of strong cautionary tale about what happens when people try to force things that work at pilot scale into commercial scale and don't. You end up investing $300 million in plants that can't produce. So some lessons to be learned there. Any other questions come in before we move on? I move quickly to the word 11:30. So
Yeah, no, I think people are really excited to start digging into the sustainability.
all right, we'll go a bit more
and
quickly through
alternative.
these ones then. So again, this is not any industry or company's perspective. This is sort of my approach to synthesize these things. So when we talk about sustainability, what do we really mean? And in the middle, DFE is design for environment. This has to be key. Designers have to be involved early on to understand what the capabilities are of the materials that they're choosing. And you've got all these different things to think about when you talk about defining sustainability. Resource efficiency, a non-fossil base, LCA score, and end of life. How do all these things work together or work against each other? One way, would be to try and use these data and to try and visualize it, right? Do 2x2s, do matrices, do scoring charts, Venn diagrams, spider charts. There's a lot of different ways that we can do it. This again is just a sort of visual example of how we should be doing it, I think, because too often these things are done in a vacuum, and then somebody later in the supply chain may be stuck if they could have talked about it further. And then what is the correct metric for it, right? In terms of climate change and global warming, GHG emissions are still probably, the main thing that people talk about, because that's the sort of, the absolute fundamental metric by which people are measuring any type of improvement. But in plastics, or particularly recyclability is a huge element, right? We see this where people will state that things are recyclable. It's true, physically it's true, scientifically it's true, but it doesn't happen because there's no system set up to do it. So a plastic is theoretically recyclable an infinite number of times. But if you have single stream recycling like I do here, and you push everything into that single bin, more than likely it's not getting sorted and it's all ending up in one place. So what makes a package sustainable then? Again, one approach, as I put together, if you look at all of these things together at the same time and weight them accordingly, there's some questions, like any good sort of process. If you ask the right questions up front, it can lead to good answers. So form, function, and end of life from a design. How do we get end of life incorporated into the design element? Material choices, it's very difficult for people that aren't specialists in any world of material selection. Bio-based does not necessarily mean that it's going to be better than a fossil-based one if there's polyethylene and polypropylene, for example, are super efficient, super lightweight, relatively low GHG emissions compared to some others, and they are recycled in a known supply system. PLA is not, for example. Mono versus multi-layer, there's a lot of work being done here to develop mono-layer materials that won't upset current recycling streams. Weight, recyclability, and then of course profitability. No one's going to do these if they can't make money. That's just the way it is. But if charges or levies are added onto these, can we start talking about things like EPR, which is extended producer responsibility?
Conor,
So
on that last, there's a comment, and then I have a question. The comment is just on a previous slide. Thanks to you for including human health, because a lot of times in these conversations that bit is lost a bit. Yeah, there we go.
Absolutely.
We focus on the environmental and on the metrics and kind of forget that there's humans involved in all steps of the process. So, something we've talked a lot about in terms of criticisms of circular economy in general. And of course, for packaging, there's a lot of people that touch it over the course of its life cycle. So that's the comment. And then I have a question on your 2 slides from here, your last slide. This one here, you talked about bio-based versus fossil-based, and I'm no staunch defender of PLA. I think there's a lot of issues with it as well. All of the same issues with everything that we do with corn in this country, in the US. But from a LCA convention, I wanted to ask you about this. The concept behind plastic that is plant derived is this idea of biogenic carbon, where it's kind of assumed that as it grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then as it's used and decomposed or incinerated or whatever, it releases that same carbon dioxide, and it's a net zero carbon from that growth and production perspective, relative to I mean, as a chemical engineer, I'm well aware that polypropylene and others are really efficient and very low carbon for the intended use from an LCA standpoint for the per intended use, but per functional unit. But I wonder how those compare, and if you kind of agree with that convention of LCA, or if that's something that you or others are starting to really question.
Everything you said is accurate, Asheen. The issue seems to be in the other elements of LCAs, like the water usage in eutrophication, fertilizer required to grow it. All that stuff gets incorporated into the LCA, and it does. Again, it goes back to the you pull a lever here, it's going to change something elsewhere. That seems to be one of the biggest issues in changing the score of PLA versus the others. But also the end of life. Nothing biodegrades in anaerobic conditions, right? Whether it's made of corn or fossil-based stuff, it just sits there, right? So there's a separate sort of provocative question, like what's so bad about a well-managed landfill, which nobody really wants to talk about, but it has to come up because there's so many landfills. So I don't know if that answers the question directly. I mean, there's tons of information on that. That we can talk about. I can share some links as well. But generally speaking, so Tesco is a big grocery market in England. They have operations in all over Europe. They tried in the States, it didn't do too well. Different story there, but they have banned PLA. They don't want it in their stores. They don't want it in any packaging that comes into their stores, because they have developed a traffic light system, red, amber, and green, as the English would say, of materials that fit in what they've deemed to be their sustainability management program, their sustainable materials management. And PLA is red. It's out. They don't want it. You can't supply it into them. Interesting.
Yeah, the sentiment on the chat is we've got enough plastics circling around the apparel and fashion industry. Let's figure out what to do with them rather than introducing things like PLA.
Yeah. So the fight is the lower right here. Just again, we talk about human health. You talk about the environment. Who's lobbying for the environment? Okay, I mean Greenpeace and their ilk, are doing something like that. But the notion of cost externalities is a sort of favorite topic of mine that we talked about a lot at Babson all those years ago, and they're starting to be discussed a little bit more often these days. What's the social cost that gets? If you're privatizing all these gains and passing on the losses to society, those items, those goods, those materials are not being priced correctly. Just one very sort of quick example of how these things, can be assessed. Like I say, these stand-up retortable or resealable pouches, we're seeing these everywhere. They're super efficient. When you look at how many can be packed onto a truck, it can be 8 times more than what was the previous package style. That's great for efficiency. It's much fewer trucks on the road. But does it lead to what we'll see then as potentially this paradox of just because you can make more of them more efficiently, does it mean we consume so many more of them, right? Some of the pros and cons are outlined here in that slide. Again, when you look at recyclability versus the footprint from a design perspective, there are certain things that designers can do, material designers can help, keeping things mono-layer, making the molding a little bit easier so you reduce the amount of process steps. Making things from compatible polymers. And then in countries like France, where they've now added bonus or malus points to particular packages, you can actually gain either a tax credit or less of a levy than you would if it was made out of multiple materials. And there's some recycling potential if things are made from the same polymer family or from a mono material. Just so you guys have some I guess, perspective on what you may have heard people talking about chemical recycling, which is actually a little bit more complicated than it may be at the initial level. There's physical recycling, where what they say the molecular structure is preserved. That's the way to think about it. So again, you can grind plastics up. You can add in solvents to take away like the nylon layers or the metallized layers. These are solvents. They're not changing the polymeric structure. Chemical recycling, or sorry, molecular, where the molecular structure is broken up, tends to have more specific terms for that. You know, solvolysis or solvolysis, thermolysis. These can be used to break the inherent energy from a polymer chain down into monomers that can then be repolymerized back into it, which is, you know, getting very close to a closed loop. Or they can be used for waxes and gases, synthetic gas and things like that. So again, highly efficient use because there's so much embedded energy. But this is an area that is getting a lot of attention and a lot of investment, and also a lot of scrutiny, because some companies are saying they can do things that they can't, which really just goes to show that, you know, there's always going to be scam artists and con men out there, you know, trying to take advantage of some ignorance maybe in the market, or having an Enron type situation where the smartest guys in the room come in and develop, you know, very complex, obscure business models that leads to a lot of funding, but not necessarily to a whole lot of profits. So really what we want to leave you with a little bit is a thought on, like, you know, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to materials management, especially in plastics, right? Because yeah, I mean, probably the best package is one that doesn't require it at all, but you can't use banana leaves for everything, right? I mean, it's just not practical in the world that we live in. Are the markets beginning to understand cost externalities? Maybe at some places in Europe, when EPR is not, you know, like a stake through the heart of an industry. It doesn't have to be that way. There are some small examples of where it's working better. Europe seems to have a different combination of high prices and stronger regulations that force them to act differently than we do. Just as an anecdote here, I mean, like the codes that you see on the bottom of plastic containers here, they're not recycling codes, those are resin identification codes. Only 39 states in America have ratified that as a system. So I don't know who the 11 are that haven't done it, but if we can't get 50 out of 50 on something like that, then, you know, it's going to be difficult to have uniform approach to any type of regulation or standards, even within the plastics industry in this country. So I will wrap it up there, and hopefully that wasn't too much of a waffle session, and you guys have some questions, or we can chat as much as we can, and I'll see if I can help answer any other questions.
Conor, that was awesome. Thank you. What we'll do now is we'll end this recording. We'll open it up to some off-the-record discussion from our Circular Fashion Group attendees, and many thanks for kind of the formal part of this, and then we'll get to the real dirt. Cheers.